Today's topic is demand-side employment and disability. My name is Fong Chan, and I am a professor and chair of the Department of Rehabilitation Psychology and Special Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. According to the World Health Organization, one of the greatest causes of suffering on earth is extreme poverty. The gulf between the poor and the rich of the world is actually widening. In the United States, incomes for the highest earning 1% of Americans skyrocketed 31% between 2009 and 2012, while the rest of the country grew an average of only 0.4%. Poverty and income inequity have direct and indirect effects on the social, mental, and physical well-being of people with or without disabilities. A recent study by Mitra and her colleagues with fundings from the World Bank using economic data of people with disabilities in 15 developing countries, and they found that disability is significantly associated with higher levels of poverty, as well as lower educational attainment, lower employment rates, and higher medical expenditures. In the United States, the U.S. Census Bureau indicated that about 19% of Americans had a disability in 2010. And less than half of the people with disabilities aged 21 to 64, about 41%, were employed at the time of the interview, whereas 80% of the people in this age group without disabilities were employed. The Great Recession, which began in 2007 and officially ended in 2009, also had a significant impact on workers with disabilities, with the number of employed workers with disabilities declining at a rate more than 3 times than that of workers without disabilities. And even today, the unemployment rate of people without disabilities is about 5%, and the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is about 10%. And here I'm showing you a graph of the disability gap, and you can see from 2009, 10, 11, and 12, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities are consistently higher than people without disabilities. 2/3 of the unemployed people with disabilities indicated that they would like to work but could not find jobs. The median earnings for people with disabilities who are employed are about $19,500 per year, comparing to $29,997 per year for people without a disability. For people with disabilities, about 8 in 10 were not considered in the labor force in 2009, compared to only 3 in 10 among those without a disability. Also, employers appear to be conflicted regarding the employability of people with disabilities. In general, they express positive attitudes towards people with disabilities. However, when you press them about actual hiring, employers often indicate reluctance to recommend hiring decisions. Hernandez and her colleagues describe employer receptivity to people with disabilities as a veneer. They concluded that commitment to non-discrimination in the workplace is less than widespread, given the inconsistency between employers' self-reported willingness to hire people with disabilities and the actual hiring outcome of people with disabilities. They found employers are less likely to endorse employment of applicants if given information that the person is a person with a disability. Employers' attitudes also change if they think it will cost them and it will require a lot of effort, such as reasonable accommodation, when in fact most job accommodation will cost less than $1,000. employers are also not aware of some of their social stigma towards the marginalized group. A study conducted by two economists at the University of Chicago and published in the American Economic Review in 2003 indicated that employers actually continue to discriminate African American applicants for jobs. And basically, they use black-sounding names and white-sounding names for their study. They prepared several resumes with exactly identical contents. The only thing that they manipulate is the names. Either the resume use a black-sounding name or a white-sounding name, and they associate the white-sounding name with white neighborhood, and then black-sounding name with black neighborhood, and they submit those resumes to job openings posted in newspapers in Chicago and Boston. And they found that if you have a black-sounding name, you have 15% less chance of getting a call for interview. And this outcome is actually consistent across business and industries, and regardless of sizes of the business, small, medium, and large, and also regardless if the business claim that they're a progressive company or if they're a more conservative company. In addition, Ren Gaillard at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and William Dickens at Northeastern University, they're both economists, they examined the beverage curves for different ages, industries, and education levels to see who benefit from the recovery and who are leaving behind by the recovery. And the beverage curve shows the relationship between job openings and employment. Basically, the more opening there are, the less unemployment there should be. However, the curve will shift up as more openings do not translate into less unemployment. Then it may be a sign of structural unemployment. In their study of recent recovery after the Great Recession, they look at the curve across all ages, industries, and educational level, and they find that it works basically, except for people who are unemployed for more than 6 months. And for those people, the curve actually shifts up for everybody. If you have been unemployed longer than 6 months, regardless of your educational level, regardless of your age, and regardless of the industries. So they did an additional study. They do a few experiments. So they sent out 4,800 fictitious resumes to 600 job openings, with 3,600 of them for fake unemployed people. And among those 3,600 resumes, he varied how long those applicants have been out of work, how often they switched jobs, and whether they had any industry experience. Everything else was kept constant. And the fictitious resumes were all male, and they were randomly selected, and they all had similar education backgrounds. The question was which of them would get callbacks. And they found that employers prefer applicants who have been out of work for not very long, and applicants who have industry experience, and applicants who have not moved between jobs that much. And the study indicated that people with relevant experience who had been out of work for more than 6 months or longer get called back a lot less than people even without relevant experience, but been out of work shorter, less than 6 months. And actually, the callback rate for people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months is very, very small. And so you have to think about people with disabilities. Many of them actually have been out of work for more than 6 months. And so we could look at, what do we need to do in order to improve employment outcomes of people with disabilities so that they can find career paths that will let them move out of poverty and into middle-class living. And we are actually very good in doing supply-side type rehabilitation, but we are not as good in doing demand-side employment. So traditionally, we are very good in providing vocational rehabilitation services to improve functioning, stamina, and job skills, along without taking into account the role of business, organizational behaviors, employer needs, and the changing labor economy. For example, the recent Great Recession. And so, therefore, supply-side employment models ignore variables related to employer demand and also the interaction of employer demand characteristics and supply-side factors as predictors of employment outcomes for people with disabilities. And for a long time, vocational rehabilitation researchers also do not pay a lot of attention to employer practice and employer behaviors and employment engagement. And rehabilitation researchers need to move beyond the supply-side focus in vocational rehabilitation research and develop a better understanding of the real concerns of employers in the hiring and retaining of people with disabilities to be able to better address employers' needs and concerns. This is consistent with the recent development, the Workforce Opportunity and Innovation Act, and the rehabilitation amendments that were passed in 2015. And one of the major focus of the Act is on employer engagement, and relationship. And actually, when Joe Biden submitted the job-driven training report to Obama, in that report, it's only 6 pages long, and the term middle class appeared 22 times. And so it reflects the support of both the Republicans and the Democrats on rebuilding the middle class and also helping people with or without disabilities find career pathways to the middle class. So the objective of this webinar, is to kind of overview the concept of demand-side employment and job placement for people with disabilities. And also, I will review some of the recent research related to attitude towards people with disabilities, and also analyzing workplace discrimination, and also survey of employers' perspective on the employment of people with disabilities. And we will discuss how this information can be used to formulate targeted strategies and policies to increase employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So what's the focus of demand-side employment? Well, the focus of demand-side employment models is on the employer and the work environment. That's the occupational shifts and industrial changes. Demand-side driven employment strategies must emphasize the preparation of people with disabilities for jobs that the employers need to fill. And vocational rehabilitation professionals must have a comprehensive understanding of the real concerns of employers and about hiring people with disabilities and be able to address employers' concerns and needs. The focus of demand-side employment models is also on job placement of people with disabilities with all types of disabilities and all levels of severity and not just people with significant disabilities. The focus of demand-side employment is participation of people with disabilities in occupations representing all levels of complexity from unskilled occupations to professional, technical, and managerial occupations. And I'm showing you some of the demand occupations that I extracted from the U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Labor, and some of those are, for example, high-tech occupations, some of them are healthcare occupations, and some of them are sales-type occupations and service industries. Also, in order to understand employer behaviors, we may want to know what employers are looking for when they are conducting a job interview. Here I am showing you a study that was conducted by Huffcott and some of his colleagues. They basically analyze what are the typical constructs are being evaluated in job interviews. And basically, they reviewed 47 employment interview studies in their meta-analysis. And they find that actually employers basically, regardless of interview type, structured or unstructured interviews, they tend to look at several psychological constructs when they interview a person. For example, they will be trying to evaluate mental abilities. And within the mental abilities, they're looking at general mental ability, which is related to the overall ability to learn and process information. They're also looking at applied mental skills, application of mental ability to make decisions, to make judgment, to solve problems, and to plan. And they're also looking at creativity. And when they average out the 37 studies, they find that actually creativity and job performance are quite related, with a relationship at 0.58, and applied mental skills and job performance 0.28, and general mental ability is related to job performance at about correlations of 0.24. And they also interview people by evaluating their knowledge and skills. And basically, knowledge and skills correlate with job performance at 0.42. And they also look at basic personality tendency. And within that, they pay a lot of attention to what we call agreeableness, which is the basic desire to be liked and to fit in with other people. And agreeableness correlate with job performance at correlation of 0.51. And they also look at applied social skills, which is the ability to function effectively in social situations. And the correlations between these two constructs at 0.39. And also that's why in rehabilitation, we put a lot of attention to workplace socialization skills training for people with disabilities. And they also look at interests and preferences, and the correlation is about 0.24. And they look at organizational fit, and the relationship is about 0.49. And they also look at physical appearance. And actually, there's no data on relationship between physical appearance and job performance data. And however, it could affect people with disabilities if employer put a lot of emphasis on physical appearance. And another study that I want to share with you is a survey by the U.S. Department of Labor, the Office of Disability Employment Policy. Basically, they survey employers and ask them what are their barriers and facilitators of hiring people with disabilities. So in this study, they basically conducted focus group research in 13 major metropolitan areas with 26 groups of private sector, executive level managers, and human resources professionals. And the key questions that they asked was, what one thing would need to change to improve the hiring climate for people with disabilities? And what they find is this. Employers said they need more accurate and practical information to dispel preconceptions and concerns about hiring people with disabilities. Employers are also concerned that people with disabilities cannot do the type of work that the organization needs to have done. Employers want credible information, including facts and statistics, to dispel the myths and the misconceptions about people with disabilities. And employers want immediate concerns involve retention and return to work of injured workers, not recruiting and hiring of people with disabilities. And so in our own research, we received some money from the National Science Foundation, and actually we make a video with about 7 people with disabilities who work successfully in science and technology job in Chicago. And we make a 30 minutes video showing them working successfully on the job and by interviewing them and their supervisors. And that's probably one way that we can incorporate this kind of information to help employers see real people with disability performing real jobs in the world of work. And I would imagine that we can incorporate some of these videos in diversity and inclusion training for business and corporations. And the ODEP also conducted an additional study and survey employers' perspective on the employment of people with disabilities after the focus group study. And this one is a large survey study. And they have looking at small, medium, and large companies. And across 12 industries: wholesale, construction, retail, transportation, information, financial, professional, education, hospitality, manufacturing, state and local government, etc. And their sampling frame including over 7,000 companies representing over 2 million companies. And the interviews were completed with 3,797 respondents for a response rate of about 50%. That's pretty high. And they basically find that among companies in the United States, about 19% report hiring people with disabilities. Now, this is actually should be disconcerting for most of us, because most companies probably will report that they hire, or 100% of the company will say that they employ women, or probably 100% of the company would report that they hire African Americans. So only 19% of the employers said that they employ people with disabilities. This is probably not acceptable. For small companies, in general, they report 11% reported they employ people with disabilities. For medium-sized companies, about 23% reported that they hire people with disabilities. And for large company, about 53% report employing people with disabilities. And in terms of recruiting people with disabilities, about 14% report that they actively recruit people with disabilities. And the larger companies are more likely to actively recruit people with disabilities, with about 34% saying that they do that, compared to, say, 8% of smaller companies. And also service-producing industries are more likely to actively recruit than those in good-producing industries. And how to persuade companies to recruit more people with disabilities? The survey indicated that for companies that do not recruit people with disabilities, information about performance, productivity, and bottom line benefits are useful to persuade those companies. And small and medium-sized companies, information on satisfactory performance and how hiring people with disabilities can increase a company's productivities are considered more persuasive. And large companies are more likely to be persuaded to hire by means of information supported by statistics or research. So if you're doing any job development with large companies, you better go in and show them actual statistics. In terms of hiring people with disabilities, frequently cited challenges include the nature of the work cannot be effectively performed by people with disabilities, healthcare costs, workers' compensation costs, and fear of litigation, cost of hiring, and the belief that people with disabilities lack the skills and experience necessary to perform. And this is especially true and voiced by small and medium companies, and supervisors' uncertainty about how to take disciplinary action. That's a major concern of large companies. And retaining employees of disabilities, the frequently cited challenge, finding ways to return people to work after the onset of a disability is cited as a challenge by small and medium-sized companies, and retention strategies. Visible commitment from top management, mentoring, that's more for large companies, and employer tax credit, that's become important for small and medium-sized companies. I also conducted a demand-side employment survey in terms of factors affecting job placement and job retention of people with disabilities using a focus group approach in Chicago and Milwaukee. And basically, the goals of my study was to identify perceptions and barriers to hiring or retaining individuals with physical disabilities in professional occupations, identifying work performance factors that are important for meeting job demands, and identify what types of workplace support will enhance the success of people with disabilities in professional occupations, and identify what kind of job placement models will help encourage employers to hire people with disabilities in professional occupations. So basically, we conducted 3 focus groups with human resources managers who hire people with disabilities into high technology, information technology type occupations. And we conducted the focus group in Milwaukee, Chicago, and the suburb of Chicago. And basically, those human resources managers express how they define productivity as quantity as well as quality, and meeting specific goal and improving process, timeliness, coming in on budget without incurring additional expense, contributing to the productivity of the team and unit, and positive social relationship at work. And human resources managers' perspective in terms of productivity issues will be reduced time to fill talents and also retention of high qualified and productive employees. And what are some of the productivity concerns of human resources managers, project managers, and hiring and any managers with hiring authorities? Will be low productivity, high mistakes, lack of experience, lack of supply of qualified personnel with disabilities, lack of time to train, people with disabilities may need special treatment, people with disabilities may need more training, more supervision, more special needs, can create resentment among co-workers and can affect morale, and lower skill sets, reduce physical stamina, and people with disabilities are slower learners, may need more supervision, perceptions that employers need to lower standards. Now, those are not the concerns of the people that we conduct focus group with, but those are the concerns that they express, that they think some human resources managers and hiring managers may have, and that may pose a barrier, may present a barrier for hiring people with disabilities. And the participants in our focus group also share that some of the attitude-based concerns that may prevent human resources managers to hire people with disabilities include that other employees would be fearful of individuals with disabilities, that co-workers may be close-mindedness and lack of acceptance, and maybe co-workers cannot see full disability. Other employer concerns will be they don't know how to interview individuals with disabilities, they don't have knowledge regarding the ADA resources, people with disabilities are frequently being screened out before getting a chance to interview, the risk aversion theory, easy to hire but difficult to fire, lack of familiarities with disability-related issues, lack of exposure to successful stories, lack of exposure to people with disabilities, do not know how to develop a relationship with people with disabilities, concern about individuals with a disability fitting into the corporate culture, and also co-workers do not feel comfortable communicating with people with disabilities. And also, applicant pool of qualified individuals with disabilities small has been cited as a potential barrier. Diversity training is offered only occasionally, and disability is not emphasized. Lack of practice, do not interview that many people with disabilities, do not have enough exposure to quickly learn to communicate with people with disabilities, do not know etiquette in communicating with people with disabilities, do not know how to discuss disability with people with disabilities. And disability is not one of the focus of diversity and inclusion policies in companies. So then they also kind of brainstorm with us in terms of what are some of the strategies to improve hiring. And some of that they identify as the use of temporary employment as a starting point, more effectively use of internship, contract to hire is a good way to test out whether they want to hire people with disabilities for long term. Employer consultation services by job placement agencies, better assessment, better job matching, linking disability explicitly as part of this diversity, disability as a culture, and need to have more successful stories, visible TV and other media, and better outreach efforts to the disability community. And training to help employees feel comfortable interacting with people with disabilities will help. And companies must have clearly communicated strategies for hiring people with disabilities. Resources that would allow companies to be proactive in recruitment, and services to better prepare people with disabilities for the demand of the job. So those are strategies identified in our focus group study. And so in summary, what are some of the myths about people with disabilities in the workplace? From this study, we can summarize it that people with disabilities are thought to require extra time to learn new work tasks. People with disabilities are stereotyped to think that they require some sort of job accommodations, and not everyone requires that. People with disabilities have trouble getting their work done on time and often need others to help them finish the job. And co-workers are not very comfortable working with this group of individuals. People with disabilities tend to call in sick more often, and people with disabilities have trouble getting along with others on the job. So if these are some of the myths that employers and co-workers still have about people with disabilities, then we have to do a better job in educating or in help dispelling these kind of myths about people with disabilities using multiple media. For example, videos and also educational materials that provide statistics and research finding that demonstrate people with disabilities are just like any workers without disabilities. And so based on the focus group study, I then developed a large survey, and we conducted a survey to look at demand-side factors related to employment of people with disabilities and survey employers in the Midwest regions of the United States. And we basically surveyed 138 human resources managers and line managers in the Midwest regions of the United States. And basically, in the employer survey, we cover several major factors, whether the human resources managers are familiar with ADA and job accommodation, whether they have any concern about disability management, what are their attitudes, either negative or positive, what's the diversity climate in the company, what are the inclusion of disability in the diversity efforts, and what are some of the commitments of the company and managers to hire people with disabilities. And basically, this is what we found. The human resources managers and the hiring managers indicated that their companies, most of their companies support diversity. But their emphasis of diversity is on gender, race, and sexual orientation, etc., but not on disability. And hiring people with disabilities not in the diversity plan. And no incentives or quotas to hire or retain people with disabilities at the department or unit levels. And hiring managers are not trained in diversity management related to individuals with disabilities. And interestingly, actually a recent study of Fortune 500 companies, and actually they find that only about 50, half of the Fortune 500 companies reported that they have included disability in their diversity and inclusion policy. And the employers in the Midwest region of the United States indicated that resources for recruiting people with disabilities are limited. Disability sensitivity training for line managers is less than adequate. Hiring managers have no problem hiring and retaining people with disabilities in their department. Human resources managers believe that people with disabilities have workplace socialization skills, are reliable, can perform essential tasks, and probably meet productivity standards. Hiring people with disabilities can help promote an inclusive workplace, and hiring people with disabilities provide opportunities for employees to learn to work with people from diverse groups. And human resources managers indicated that they're not as familiar with ADA as they should, and there are in-house resources to help them with employment-related ADA issues. And human resources managers indicated that they are familiar with government resources for ADA and employment technical assistance. However, they also indicated that there's no in-house job accommodation experts for consultation. And the participants in our studies indicated that, I repeated that slide, but so then we also provided the correlational matrix for all those 11 factors, and we then use a regression analysis to use those factors to predict employers' commitment to hire people with disabilities. And so the results indicated that those demand-side factors actually predict employer commitments to hire people with disabilities pretty well. The R-square is 0.58. That means about 58% of the variance in the commitment to hire people with disability scores can be accounted for by the demand-side employment factors. And when we examine the predictors, we find that only contact with disability, company size, the larger company size is more related to commitment to hire people with disabilities, and knowledge of ADA and job accommodations, and also inclusion of disability in diversity efforts are all related to commitment to hire people with disabilities. When you look at the beta weight, the inclusion of disability in diversity efforts actually have the highest beta weight, and the standardized beta coefficients 0.57, indicating that for every standard deviation unit change in inclusion of disability in diversity efforts will result in 0.57 standard deviation unit change in the commitment to hire people with disabilities. In addition to this study, Bob Fraser and I'm a co-worker of that, I'm a co-author of that study, also conducted a study to try to understand employers' hiring intention in relation to qualified workers with disabilities. And they use a theory of planned behavior approach, and basically they're looking at employer attitude towards hiring people with disabilities, the subjective norm, the climate of the company in hiring people with disabilities, and the perceived control in terms of hiring people with disabilities, and how that will then improve the intention to hire people with disabilities. And so attitude towards the behavior is the degree of negative or positive evaluation of that behavior, subjective norm, the perceived social pressure to perform that behavior, perceived control, perceived ability to carry out the behavior. And they conducted a focus group study with 92 members of the Seattle and Portland area in Rotary clubs and the Human Resources Special Interest Group within the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. And Table 4 presented the normative belief of the different groups. And you can see actually the government agencies has higher normative belief, and also the human resources managers have higher normative belief and intention. And also the CEOs of companies also have a higher normative belief, and then relationship in terms of intention to hire people with disabilities. The multiple regression results indicated that attitude, subjective norm, and perceived control all predicted intention to hire people with disabilities, with the predictor subjective norm have the highest beta weight. That means if you're going to do any intervention, maybe changing the social pressure or the social climate in the company to hire people with disabilities will be probably the most important factor to intervene. And so they concluded the theory of planned behavior can be successfully used to predict intention, and both attitudes and perceived behavioral control also make contribution to the prediction, but the subjective norm were found to be most important. And they make some recommendation to use the theory of planned behavior to improve employment hiring intentions of employers. And for example, they think that state administrators of vocational rehabilitation need to target their marketing and educational effort to the C-suite and top-level executive, as well as mid-level managers, in order to establish normative expectations supportive of vocational rehabilitation hiring activities. And also, avenue to management might be through chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, societies for human resources managers, and state business leadership networks. And marketing and educational efforts must emphasize positive attitudinal beliefs and perceived control beliefs. For example, receive supportive communication from senior management, tax credit hiring incentives. Those can be useful for mid-level managers, and also in order to increase the interest of human resources and hiring managers to hire people with disabilities. And educational marketing approaches must customize to company size. Smaller companies may be appealed to with the more human commitment and loyalty on the part of the workers with disabilities and the positive feelings related to this type of hiring. And for small business owners and administrators, we have to allay the concern they need to reveal offsetting data that negates the productivity, litigation, and incapacity to accommodate their concerns. Mid-sized companies may be more concerned about the performance of workers with disabilities and how this type of hiring benefits the bottom line. And bottom line benefits like tax credits, currently up to $6,000 first year for a worker with disabilities, and also on the job training monies, etc. Must work with senior management to address mid-level and team managers' negative reactions, as well as co-workers' discomfort with lack of receptivity to this type of hiring. And for large companies, it's important to address the normative concerns that the department and team managers would not feel that hiring people with disabilities is a worthwhile practice. And state agencies must make it easy for employers to contact them for the purpose of hiring or understanding the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. For example, many state agencies now have the dual customer approach and try to be more engaging with people with employers. Another study that are useful for us to think about demand-side employment was conducted by Dennis Gilbride and his associates, and they conducted a study to identify the characteristics of work environments and employers open to hiring and accommodating people with disabilities. And the sampling frame successfully employ people, companies that successfully employ people with disabilities, and employers who have successfully hired and integrated people with disabilities into their workforces, and job placement specialists who have worked closely with employers and have successfully placed many people with disabilities. And what did they find? First, work cultural issues. Employers include people with disabilities with all workers and treat them equally are more likely to hire people with disabilities. Employers welcome diversity and they are egalitarian and inclusive, more likely to hire people with disabilities. Employers' management style is more personal and flexible. Employers focus on a worker's employment and not his or her disability. And senior management expects and rewards disability. And employers are comfortable providing accommodation for all the employees. And this kind of cultural climate tend to foster the more likelihood of hiring people with disabilities. Job match. Employers focuses on the consumer's capabilities and effectively match the person with the job requirements. The employer obtain input from people with disabilities on their ability to perform job duties, and he or she include people with disabilities in all accommodation discussions. The employer focuses on essential rather than marginal functions, and the employer offers internship, and they often lead to jobs. Employer experience. The employer has the ability to supervise a diverse workforce, and if they have this experience, more likely to hire people with disabilities. The employers view the community rehabilitation program or voc rehab agencies as a partner and as an ongoing employment support resources. They're more likely to hire people with disabilities. And the principal barriers to employ people with disabilities are lack of awareness of disability and accommodation issues, concern over cost, and fear of legal liability. In addition, we did one more study looking at what are employers' myths about different disability types. So we use basically the common myth of employers' stigma about people with disabilities in terms of their work performance, in terms that they call in sick more often, in terms that the co-workers are not comfortable working with them, etc., etc. So we created a 10-item scale that basically reflect those myths. And then we asked employers to respond or to rate workers with different disabilities or other marginalized characteristics. Like we did this study in Taiwan. So like migrant worker is a marginalized group, high school students are marginalized group, single parents are marginalized group. We add that as basically as a reference group. And then we have traditional disability group like mental retardation, mental illness, visual impairment, etc. And then we have chronic illness group like spinal cord injury, like epilepsy, low back pain, cancer, etc. And then we have some less or most stigmatized group in Taiwan, like HIV/AIDS and AODA. And so by giving this survey to employers with disabilities, we then use a multidimensional scaling to map the employers' grouping of disability and in terms of their stigmatization about those people as productive workers in the workplace. And so we use cluster analysis to group them, and then we use multidimensional scaling to map them. And basically we find that, for example, employers in Taiwan group the people without disabilities together. So the migrant worker, the high school students, and the single parent as one group. And then they group the people with chronic illness, chronic disease as one group, epilepsy, low back pain, and cancer, along with older adults. And then the traditional disability group, mental retardation, mental health, visual impairment, and spinal cord injury. And then the societally most concerned or most stigmatizing group, HIV/AIDS, and substance abuse in Taiwan. And basically, we find that the employers actually are more willing to hire people who are marginalized but without disabilities over any disability groups. And the most stigmatized group in Taiwan that employers are not willing to hire people with HIV/AIDS, and also substance abuse. And employers are more willing to hire people with chronic illness, cancer, epilepsy, low back pain, older adult. And then the next group will be people with traditional disabilities. And also, I'm showing you another study that demonstrates the cost of workplace accommodation for people with disabilities are relatively low, and most of the job accommodation costs are less than $1,000. So this basically, this webinar basically does not cover all the demand-side employment studies that we can find in the literature, but it's basically a selected review of the literature that we basically think provide a good starting point for us to understand employer practice and employer behaviors, and then it will allow us to start to think about how we can develop better way to improve employer engagement and begin to work better with employers to help them hire people with disabilities. For example, in my Midwest study, we did find that companies that include disability in their diversity and inclusion policy, they are more likely to hire people with disabilities. So therefore, intervention at the higher level, at the upstream level, working with people at the C-suite level, the CEOs, the COOs, the CFOs, the CIOs, etc., to help them incorporate disability in the inclusion and diversity policy may be actually more important than helping to provide, say, AODA training or job accommodation training, because without inclusion of disability in the inclusion and diversity policy, that then it will be less likely that you can change the behavior of mid-level managers and human resources managers, because they would need normative belief in order, or social pressure in the company, and also resources from the company policies in order to change the behavior to be more willing to hire people with disabilities. Now, another thing that from these studies that we also know that employers still hold, or a lot of employers still hold a lot of myth about people with disabilities. And therefore, we do have to develop ways to dispel that myth. For example, we have recently developed a 30 minutes video on the ADA and the ADAA with funding from the Social Security Administration. So for example, the two videos that we have, the forerunner on people with disabilities working successfully in high technology occupations, and the ADAAA can be easily incorporated into disability diversity training that we can offer to companies that if they're interested in including disability in their diversity training, we could easily use those two videos to conduct training for employers as a door openers, a foot in the door. Say, if we can provide this kind of training for employers, maybe then we can then provide additional training or do additional job development with the employers to help them hire people with disabilities. So these several studies basically can serve as a starting point for us to begin to conceptualize how we can work with employers in order to improve the working relationship between state agencies and vocational rehabilitation professionals and employers working together to improve the hiring and retaining of people with disabilities. Thank you for attending this webinar.